Dairy is once again at the center of Canada-U.S. trade tension. The U.S. says Canada isn't living up to the spirit of the agreement when it comes to dairy imports, while Canada insists this current system is essential to protect our dairy farmers.
To ensure long-term certainty of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, the United States is calling for sweeping changes within the dairy market.
A big trade fight is starting. Canada can't say yes, even if it wanted to. A new law blocks the door, stopping U.S. demands cold. As the deadline gets closer, pressure keeps rising. But this strong rule may actually protect Canada's farmers and future. What happens next could change everything, and not in the way you expect. There is a trade fight currently unfolding between the United States and Canada, where one side is making demands and the other side literally cannot say yes, not as a negotiating position, not as a bluff, but because a law passed in June 2025 makes the concessions being demanded legally impossible. Donald Trump wants access to Canada's dairy market. Mark Carney is not refusing to give it because he lacks the political will. He is refusing because the Parliament of Canada has removed the option from the table by statute. That combination, aggressive American demands colliding with a legal wall erected specifically to deflect them, is what makes this dispute so consequential, as the July 1st CUSMA review deadline bears down on both governments. Canada's dairy industry is currently valued at $16.93 billion and projected to reach $21.38 billion by 2031. At the production level alone, it generates $21.7 billion annually, supports 221,000 full-time jobs, and contributes $19.9 billion directly to Canada's GDP. In Quebec specifically, 360,000 dairy cows are spread across 137 processing facilities. This is not a niche sector that trade negotiators can quietly restructure in a hotel conference room. It is a regional economy, a political constituency, and a cultural institution in Canada's largest French-speaking province, a province whose seats determine the outcome of federal elections. The system protecting that industry is called supply management, and it has been operating since the 1970s. It functions through three interlocking mechanisms. Production quotas control how much milk each farm can produce, preventing oversupply and maintaining price stability. Price floors guarantee farmers earn enough to remain profitable regardless of global market swings. And import tariffs are set at levels that are not merely protective, they are prohibitive. The tariff on liquid milk runs to 241%. On butter, it reaches 298%. These numbers are not designed to make American dairy products slightly more expensive in Canada. They are designed to make them economically non-viable, protecting Canadian farmers from a U.S. industry that produces at significantly larger scale with different cost structures. American dairy producers thought they had finally cracked this system when Trump negotiated CUSMA during his first term. The agreement granted U.S. producers tariff-free access to 3.6% of Canada's dairy market, celebrated at the time as a long-awaited foothold after decades of being shut out. What happened next is the specific source of the current fury in Washington. American dairy exports to Canada barely moved. The reason was not new tariffs or explicit new barriers. It was how Canada structured the quota allocation behind the scenes, assigning that tariff-free access primarily to Canadian processors, companies that already depend on domestic milk and have essentially no operational incentive to import American products. Access technically exists on paper. In practice, it goes to the one group least likely to use it. American dairy groups have named this strategy quota manipulation compliance, with the letter of the trade agreement combined with systematic undermining of its intent. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer laid this out directly in congressional testimony, accusing Canada of maintaining policies that unfairly restrict market access and making explicit that dairy is a priority for the upcoming CUSMA review. A bipartisan group of 74 members of Congress signed a letter demanding action on this issue, led by representatives calling out what they characterize as a deliberate workaround of Canada's commitments. Major industry organizations, including the National Milk Producers Federation and the International Dairy Foods Association, are coordinating behind a unified push. And Trump himself has been calling Canada's dairy tariffs a disgrace for years, framing the system as exploitation of American farmers that must be corrected. Now here's the factor that changes the entire negotiation dynamic and that Washington either underestimates or cannot accept. In June 2025, Canada passed Bill C-202, which received royal assent and did something that trade experts have called unprecedented in global trade policy. The law legally prohibits the Canadian government from increasing tariff rate quotas or reducing tariffs on dairy, poultry, and eggs in any future trade negotiation. The concessions the United States is demanding are not merely politically difficult for the current government to make. They are illegal. This constraint does not bind only Mark Carney. It binds every future Canadian government until the law itself is changed. Former trade negotiators describe this as effectively forcing Canada to enter talks with one hand tied behind its back, which, from the Canadian dairy industry's perspective, is precisely the point. When Bill C-202 passed, the dairy farmers of Canada celebrated it as a permanent guarantee that supply management would never again be used as a bargaining chip. During the election campaign, Carney had argued the law was not strictly necessary because his government would never put supply management on the table anyway. Once in power, however, the law became something more useful than a personal commitment. It became a legal shield. When American negotiators push for dairy concessions, Carney does not have to argue about fairness or market access or agricultural economics. He can point to the law and state that even if he wanted to agree, he legally cannot, transforming what might otherwise be an ongoing negotiating debate into a structural dead end. The political geography reinforces this position at every level. Canada has 11,820 dairy farms concentrated primarily in Quebec and Ontario provinces that together hold enough parliamentary seats to determine federal election outcomes. Any signal of willingness to adjust supply management, regardless of how minor it might appear in a trade document, would trigger immediate mobilization from dairy farmers, sustained pressure from the Bloc Québécois, and a sharp reversal of public opinion in the exact ridings that decide Canadian governments. The cost of compromise is not just economic, it is potentially existential for any government that attempts it. American dairy groups have clarified that their actual demand is narrower than dismantling supply management entirely. What they want is a reallocation of how quota access is distributed away from Canadian processors who do not use it and toward retailers, restaurants, and buyers who would. Some trade lawyers have noted that Bill C-202 does not explicitly address quota allocation mechanics, creating a narrow, theoretical gray area where adjustments might be technically permissible without violating the statute. But even that narrow technical possibility runs into the political reality that Canadian dairy farmers would interpret any adjustment to quota allocation, however minor, as the first crack in a system they have spent decades building and defending. Perception matters as much as policy in this environment. And the dairy lobby has been enormously effective at ensuring that any concession is framed as the beginning of a collapse rather than a minor administrative adjustment. The broader context gives Carney additional structural leverage. Canada has been actively reducing its economic dependence on the United States throughout 2025 and into 2026. The United Arab Emirates has committed $70 billion in investment. A free trade agreement with India is under active negotiation. Canada has already doubled non-US exports, while American exports to Canada have fallen. A strategic partnership with China, announced in January, opened new agricultural export channels, including reduced tariffs on canola from 85% to 15%, with an ambitious 50% export growth target by 2030. At the Liberal Convention, Carney announced a goal of doubling non-US exports within 10 years. That diversification is not just economic strategy. It is the foundation of Canada's negotiating posture, a demonstration that Canada has options and that the threat of a damaged bilateral relationship carries costs that run in both directions. On the American side, nearly 150 industry leaders from steel, energy, agriculture, and manufacturing have warned publicly that CUSMA is critical infrastructure for their operations. The American Automotive Policy Council has emphasized the tens of billions of dollars in annual savings the agreement delivers. General Motors has highlighted supply chains so deeply integrated across North American borders that they cannot be quickly replaced. A CUSMA collapse triggered by a dairy dispute would disrupt industries that have nothing to do with milk, and those industries have made their resistance to escalation clearly known to the administration. That is the trap Trump finds himself in. His dairy producers want him to escalate. His industrial base wants him to preserve the agreement. Carney is holding a legal wall on one side and a diversification strategy on the other, with a parliamentary majority that allows him to legislate his positions without opposition interference. July 1st is approaching. The law says no. Carney says no. And the question is not really whether Canada will open its dairy market. It is what Trump is willing to accept when the answer is permanently no.